Since we've not been able to meet in person, I'm going to leave this recording behind about APIs, and it's not going to be a very long process because everything uh, in APIs draws all the way down to just the very first principles. The moment you understand the first principles, then you can keep on complicating how you'd want your code. Now, you should know one thing is that there, there are so many frameworks out there. In PHP, we have Laravel, one of the best. We have Symfony, which comes with Laravel, and so on and so forth. First, wait, puppy, puppy, puppy. Why, yeah, come, pass here. Sorry. So, many of these frameworks come with inbuilt ways of creating APIs without generating an API manually. In the previous class, I talked about connecting to the database, where we talked about two forms in which you can connect to the database. The first one was using what we called PDO, um, which is a PHP, PHP data object, which is a unique object in object-oriented programming in PHP that allows us to connect to any sort of database, whether it's MySQL, PostgreSQL, etc. But we say this is not the only choice we have. We also have what we called MySQLi. And this is mostly for people who are creating incremental or progressive applications where they can connect exclusively to MySQL databases, and it's often successful. And in one of the ways that we tried out a connection to the database, we say that we use the function require once. You locate where the database is, and then you should know what exactly was the variable that carries the database object. Which in our particular case, from here we had carried everything in. Uh, this is We had carried everything in the PDO variable and so we just call PDO, and then we prepare what we call a statement, in which this statement in through PDO we are querying everything which was the wildcard from users, and then we fetched everything and we put it in some sort of array. Okay, so for today we shall create our very first API. Let me try out with, no, this is not going to be about users. Let me try out maybe something like users.php. New file, probably let's call it users.php. So I have that, and I'm going to be explaining it shortly, one line at a time. So let me start with the comments at the very top. One thing you should know about APIs is that we need a source of data. We need a source of data. Most times, our source of data is the actual database that is connected to our um, database. Sometimes it's external data, like which we mostly call external APIs. And the good thing about PDO, as we had just mentioned yesterday, was that PDO allows us to connect to a database, in which in that particular database it can be any kind. It can be MySQL, it can be PostgreSQL, etc. It depends on what you wish. So there are different requests that we have in APIs, just like the ones we talked about in requests. The endpoints can either be GET, where someone tries to retrieve something out of the database. We can also have a GET request where we can retrieve the exact ID of the person, and then we map these things to the exact routes on which, or parameters on which someone can collect them, which are the following: the one that is slash users, the one that is slash user and their ID, and then we can also add, which is the post request. We can patch which is updating a particular record of that user, and then we can delete, which is totally erasing this person from the database. So, how do we create our own API? First things first, you should know how to declare what we call a constant in PHP. If you recall, in when we are still looking at JavaScript, we saw that declaration of a constant was just simply saying const, then you call the constant name. What is a constant? A constant is a variable that does not need to ever change forever. Do you recall the other video of mine of Jolly's that you watched and you asked me what was Jolly's Academy? I was declaring constants. So let's go line by line. This thing says this is a ternary condition. It's more of a question, I should say. And if you want to understand it, you must read it out with your mouth. It says define. And what does define do? It defines a constant in PHP. So after saying that define, we are saying we define a constant called dbHost, where we shall be adding the IP of our localhost or the host on which our server is on. We are talking about the port, which is the default port on which our database is running. I said our default port in MySQL is 3306. You need to just cram that. And I said sometimes instead of using localhost, you can use 127.0.0.1 as the IP of your local machine. And then they are asking for the name of the database. You can call it Sportscope. Then they're asking for the user. Ours is root. And then they're asking for the password. In our particular case, the root user has no password. But this is actually a question that says that define whereby the DB host is whatever value put here. And this value is more of a question. It is if there is DB host in the .m file, add it as the DB host. Else, if it's not found, that is the question mark and the colon, then attribute it to this IP that you've entered in here. So that means that the .m file overwrites whatever you've written here. This would only work if nothing has been found in the .m file. That is for security purposes, just in case a .m file has been destroyed or it hasn't been imported with your code. So we start with what we call helpers. What's the purpose of the helpers? It's to try to connect from one side to another as, let's call them ushers. That's how we call them in hotels. Hmm? So a helper is any function that helps you to guide data from one side to another. And we are trying to declare a function. To declare a function in PHP, we call function and then the function name. And inside we call upon parameters. And in these parameters, with the latest version of PHP, you can declare the data type of each parameter. The first one is data, which is mixed data. It's not just int, it's not just string, it's mixed. And the second one is a variable called status, where if none of this has been found, then the data type should be released, should be void or null. So we are trying to, the rest of the things here is to ensure that the result of whatever our API shall give should be a JSON file. When someone tries to access our endpoint on the other side, they should get a JSON. Why do we prefer JSON in REST API? It's because JSON just gives you plain text the way it is. It gives you a curly bracket where it says name, colon, Barak. Username, jakisa.barak. Phone number, 256702860347. And then the front end can capture that and then displays it in whatever cosmetics the front end developer has come up with in HTML or whatever they're building their front end with. And in contrast, if someone is submitting in something back to our API, it comes as JSON still, and then we save it. That's what we are trying to do with that hopper. And secondly, the second hopper, which is send error, is just in case there's been an error in the data being sent, where we are also following the same principle. We are saying it should also be JSON. Now, if you already have a file or to connect to your database, you don't need all this. All you need is to say, um, instead of all this, you can say require or require once, and then you mention the file that is being required, which is, I think, is it? Mm, let me see. 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 All right. So you can simply just say require once. You call this magic variable or magic keyword called directory, where you want to define the directory. And how did we define the directory to our database? We find it as this, so we concatenate it to that, so that we used concatenation yesterday, so that it's this way. Now from this you have PDO, and you can continue using PDO throughout your entire code. But if you don't want this, of which I would recommend this, then you can simply just head back to manually connecting to your database right from here, which is not advisable, because how many times are you going to keep on connecting to the database in each and every file? That is typically bad developer policy or practice. That done, after getting the variable PDO that connects to the database, the next thing to do is to create route parameters that will construct these routes that I talked about. One is to get a user from our database, another one is to get them by their unique ID or their primary key in our database, and so on and so forth. So in this hopper, we are calling a function we've decided to call pass route, which should be an array. And in this array, we are trying to, you see, this trim means to sort of trim it the way it sounds. And then we are trying to do this, but we want to just pass it so well, and it should be separated by a slash. So we are querying the server where we are requesting for the requested URI, which is an internal universal locator resource interface locator. And in doing that, we get the PHP URL path, and then we explode it. Explode is a unique functionality in PHP that does split. It finds where there are splits, and the separator of explode in this particular case is a slash. Why it says that each and every time we have a slash in the URI that we are collecting, that should be our path that we are looking for. So what do we return? We return the different paths starting with index 0, or we return, if it's not found, we return an empty string. And the ID is set is also a unique conditional statement in PHP that is as the way you sound it. It says, is it set? That's how they read it. Is set. Are the parts set? And if it's numeric, then we go with part one. Else, this is now ternary condition. If it's an integer with part one, if it's an integer of part one, then give us null. Wow, what a function. Mhm. After that function called pass route, we continue with another function that is requesting for the body, and we try to get the request body, what is part of the request. So we get a raw contents from the PHP input, and then we return the JSON decode to be raw, and then through that JSON data, if it's true, let us give us, but if it's not, then give us an empty JSON file or empty array. Then we start handling each and every one of those requests as mentioned earlier by doing exactly what we did yesterday. We prepare a statement with a PDO that we had already connected. We are going to connect it, but we first prepare a statement before we push it to the database. Now, how does this work? When we are going to communicate to the database, we prepare our statement is the first step before you open the database. Then you open a database, you retrieve or you post, then you close the database. That's why the first thing we are doing right now is we are preparing a statement where we are getting from the database, we query and select only these fields, the ID, the name, the email from a table called users. And we are ordering these things by ID, that is in ascending order. And then we return a JSON file. This is for getting users. For getting users by ID, um, we have another function here that will handle that. It prepares the statement where it selects ID, name, email from users, where ID is ID, but we prepare an extra statement where we execute exclusively the ID to be the last string attached. Then we fetch everything. But we're saying that if the user does not exist, then we should write an error that says that user with ID was not found, or we give a 404 error, and then we send the JSON of the user. So we can proceed the same with the post request, just in case someone wants to save something to the database table called users. What do we do in that particular case? We get the body that we had prepared earlier on up there of their request, and we say the following fields from whatever form they filled in to add a new user to our database. The name, email, and password hash are required. What is password hash? Password hash is an encoded version of your database, or hashed version for that sake. And then we create a for each loop where we say that for each required as field, what do we do? Because now these things are already in an array format, so we can use for each. If any one of them is empty, then we should say that missing field is required, and then you return them back. Another if statement is if the filter, no, we are going to filter by variable, but it's if the body email, then filter validate email to ensure that the email is valid. Um, this is a unique PHP feature that validates email, that they have an @ symbol, the .com, and etc. Or else, so if this is a true statement, then we send an error that invalid email. That means the email has been filtered and it's invalid. After this conditional statement and after looping through, we do what we call try and catch, and I had explained try and catch the other time. I said we use try and catch so that our code runs, and in case there is any error that has not been handled by our try, it goes straight to catch, and catch handles any kind of errors that will not follow what we expected in our try. It's a way of catching any errors that we didn't think of, because you can't think of any possible error, all possible permutations of errors that can come from your code. So in this particular one, our statement is quite longer than the prior two. We are saying that we're preparing a statement where we're getting this, and we are preparing what? We are inserting. Now you can see that earlier we were trying to select, that is getting, in SQL and in SQL language and in PHP. Whereas when you're writing to the database, you use insert into. The first one was select, then you just give what you're selecting from, then users. If you wanted to select everything, you would use a start mean asterisk to select everything. from users where. So you should know that these statements and are always in capital letters. But for this time, we are select insert into users. Then instead of using where, you just add exactly where you want to deposit these words. So that name goes is mapped to names. This is mapped to that. Then after selecting whatever you want to select in those particular fields of your database table, you say the values I want to post. Name is whatever name they submitted from the form. Email is whatever email they submitted, and the password hash is whatever has come from the password hash from the front end. Then after someone submits, we return them the ID, name, and then the email. Otherwise, after doing that, we have a second statement where we're executing. So we are trying to give them back their name, where we are trying to trim the name, and we are giving them the email, where we are trying to put it in lowercase, and the password hash. This is not this is not a good idea, but for study purposes, that's okay. So we are saying that the variable user is the statement we prepared, and then we fetch it. Now we've finished to prepare a statement, it's time to fetch it. Otherwise, if none of these works, then just give a person error, which we've given a random code 235505, and a user with email this and this already exists, which is error 409. And then we send this JSON back to them. So we repeat the same, exactly the same, but this time around including the particular ID of the person we are adding. And then we have an option to delete. So you can see that creating APIs is all about communicating with the database and then returning things in JSON format. I'll repeat, creating APIs is communicating with the database but returning data in JSON format, and it's something that is the same even in Ajax code. So our router that will dispatch everything is something that we need to look at. We are creating a new variable we are calling route, and we are assigning it another variable that is called pass route that we had earlier declared, if you remember. So the method is based on the server where we get the request method. Did someone get, push, whatever, or delete? So if route and the resource is not equal to users, send error not found. We can keep on adding more to this, but this particular API endpoint is particularly users. So if someone is trying to query something that is not users or slash users, you send them 404 error. And then you say ID equals to route ID. We get the ID. So we start mapping every request we get. So if the method is strictly get and the ID is null, then we give them handle list users. If method is post and ID is null, you give them handle create user. Single resource routes are like this, that if the method is get and the ID is not null, handle get user that we've just managed but with a parameter ID. If the method is patch and not null, the same function. If it's delete and not null, the same function. Anything else is just not supported. So we say default, send an error. And that's how we create our endpoint. So if someone visits our localhost slash user slash ID, they are directly communicating with our database. And when you're creating your forms, if you recall when we're still studying PHP and you're writing a form action, you can write a form action to these endpoints and they would actually work. Ajax works in the exact same way as this, but with a separate library that would help you with reducing the number of lines, but the same exact queries. I'll be open to any questions if you have any.